The morning air was cold when 12-year-old Sophie and her mother stepped off the train in Vienna. Sophie couldn't see the grand buildings or the bustling streets, but she could feel the energy of the city. It was different from their small village back home. Everything here moved faster, sounded louder, and felt more important. Sophie had been blind since birth. She'd never seen a sunrise, never watched leaves fall from trees, never looked at her own reflection in a mirror. But there was one thing she could do better than almost anyone she knew. She could play the piano, and today she was going to prove it to the world. Her mother held her hand tightly as they walked through the crowded streets. "We're almost there, sweetheart," she whispered. Sophie could hear the nervousness in her voice. They'd saved for 2 years to make this trip happen. Her father had worked extra shifts at the factory. Her grandmother had sold her jewelry. Even Sophie's little brother had given up his birthday money, all for this one chance. The Vienna Conservatory was the most respected music school in all of Europe. Getting accepted here meant everything. It meant proper training, real opportunities, and a future doing what Sophie loved most. But first, she had to audition in front of the conservatory's director, a famous pianist named Professor Victor Brenner. Professor Brenner was a legend. He'd played for kings and queens. He'd performed in the greatest concert halls across the world. And he had the power to make or break a young musician's career with just one word. For weeks, Sophie had practiced the piece she would play for him. She'd memorized every note, every pause, every emotion. Her fingers knew the music so well that she could play it in her sleep. When they reached the conservatory, Sophie felt her heart pounding in her chest. The building was enormous. She could tell by the echo of their footsteps in the entrance hall. Everything smelled of old wood and polish. Her mother led her to a bench where they sat with other families, all waiting for their turn. Sophie listened to the other children warming up in nearby practice rooms. Some were good. Some were brilliant. She tried not to let doubt creep in, but it was hard. What if she wasn't good enough? What if all those years of practice meant nothing? Sophie Adler. A stern voice called out after what felt like hours. Her mother squeezed her hand. "You're ready for this. Just play like you always do." Sophie stood up, her white cane tapping against the marble floor. The hallway seemed to stretch forever. Finally, they reached a massive door. Someone pushed it open, and Sophie heard gasps echo in what must have been a huge room. "This way," a woman's voice said, guiding her forward. Sophie counted her steps carefully. 23 steps to the piano. She'd been practicing with her cane for years, but walking into a strange room always made her nervous. One wrong move and she could trip, could embarrass herself before even playing a single note. Her mother helped her find the piano bench. Sophie's fingers reached out and touched the keys. They were smooth and cool. This was a beautiful instrument. She could tell just by touching it. For a moment, she forgot about everything else. When she sat at a piano, the world made sense. "State your name and what you'll be performing," came a deep, commanding voice from somewhere in front of her. "Sophie Adler," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll be playing Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11. She heard papers rustling, whispers. Then that same deep voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't asking a question. It was making a statement. "Stop." Sophie froze, her hands hovering over the keys. "This is completely inappropriate," Professor Brenner said. His voice was cold, almost angry. "Who allowed this child to audition?" Sophie felt her stomach drop. What was happening? She hadn't even played yet. "Sir, she's come all the way from—" her mother started to say. "I don't care where she's come from," the professor interrupted. "Look at her. She's blind. How can a blind person possibly become a serious pianist?" The room went silent. Sophie felt like she couldn't breathe. She'd faced doubt before. People in her village had said similar things. But never like this. Never with such certainty, such dismissal. "A pianist must see the music," Professor Brenner continued, and Sophie could tell he was standing now, probably pacing. She could hear his footsteps. "They must watch their teacher's demonstrations. They must read complex scores. They must see the passion in a composer's work, understand the visual beauty of a performance. This girl cannot do any of that." "But sir, if you just let her play—" Her mother's voice was shaking now. "There's no point," he said flatly. "I've been teaching music for 30 years. I know talent when I see it, and I know when someone is wasting everyone's time. This is a conservatory for serious musicians, not a charity for children with disabilities." Those words hit Sophie like physical blows. Each one hurt more than the last. She felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him. Music is meant to be seen as much as heard, the professor went on, his voice getting louder. The posture, the movement, the way a true musician's face reflects the emotion of the piece. How can she learn any of that? How can she teach it to future students if she's fortunate enough to make any kind of career, which I highly doubt? Sophie's mother stood up. "You're wrong," she said, her voice stronger now despite the tears Sophie could hear in it. "My daughter has more musical talent in her little finger than most people have in their whole body. She's been playing since she was 4 years old. She's won every competition in our region. Regional competitions in small villages mean nothing here." Professor Brenner replied dismissively, "I'm doing you both a favor by being honest now, rather than letting her waste years chasing an impossible dream. Take her home. Find her something she can actually do. Perhaps she could tune pianos. At least then she'd be near the music she loves." Sophie finally stood up. Her legs felt shaky, but she managed to keep her balance. Her mother took her arm, ready to lead her out of this awful place. "Wait," Sophie said quietly. Everyone in the room seemed to turn toward her. She could feel their eyes on her, pitying her, agreeing with the professor. "Can I ask you something, Professor Brenner?" There was a pause. "Then what is it? Have you ever played in complete darkness?" Another pause. "What kind of question is that?" "I'm just wondering," Sophie continued, her voice getting steadier, "if you've ever tried to play without looking at the keys. Because I do it every single day, every single time, and I've never missed a note because of it." She could hear someone in the room chuckle softly, probably at her boldness, but Professor Brenner wasn't amused. "This conversation is over," he said. "Please escort them out." As Sophie and her mother walked back down that long hallway, Sophie felt something change inside her. The hurt was still there. The humiliation burned in her chest. But underneath it all, something else was growing. Something hot and fierce and unbreakable. She didn't say anything on the long walk back to the train station. She didn't cry when they sat in their seats for the journey home. But in her mind, she made a promise to herself. One day, Professor Victor Brenner would hear her play. And when he did, he would regret every word he'd said today. She didn't know how long it would take or what she'd have to sacrifice to get there. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would prove him wrong. The train ride home felt longer than it actually was. Sophie sat by the window, her head resting against the glass. She couldn't see the countryside passing by, but she could feel the vibrations of the tracks beneath them. Her mother hadn't said much since they left Vienna. What was there to say? They'd spent everything they had for nothing. When they finally arrived back in their village, Sophie's father was waiting at the station. He didn't ask how it went. One look at his wife's face told him everything he needed to know. He just wrapped his arms around both of them and held on tight. That night, Sophie lay in her small bed staring into the same darkness she'd known her entire life. But somehow it felt heavier now. Professor Brenner's words kept echoing in her head. An impossible dream. Maybe he was right. Maybe she'd been fooling herself all along. The next morning, she almost didn't go to her piano lesson. Mrs. Chen, her teacher, lived 3 houses down from them. She was an elderly woman who'd moved to their village years ago from somewhere far away. Nobody knew much about her past except that she'd once been a concert pianist herself before arthritis had forced her to stop performing. But Sophie did go. Because even though everything hurt, even though she felt embarrassed and defeated, there was still something inside her that needed the music. Mrs. Chen was waiting in her small living room, where she kept her old, upright piano. The instrument was nothing fancy. Some of the keys stuck a little, and it hadn't been tuned in months. But it was where Sophie had learned to play, and it felt like home. "Sit down, child," Mrs. Chen said gently. She'd already heard what happened in Vienna. News traveled fast in a small village. Sophie sat at the piano bench but didn't touch the keys. "Do you know what your problem is?" Mrs. Chen asked. Sophie shook her head. "You went there asking for their approval. You gave them power over you." "He's one of the most famous pianists in the world," Sophie said quietly. "Of course he has power." "Only if you give it to him," Mrs. Chen replied. "Tell me something. When you play, when your fingers touch these keys, what do you feel?" Sophie thought about it. "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And does that feeling care whether Professor Brenner approves of it? For the first time since Vienna, Sophie felt something shift. Mrs. Chen was right. When she played, none of the outside world mattered. Not what people thought, not what they said, not whether they believed in her or not. "Play for me," Mrs. Chen said. "Play the piece you were going to perform for him." Sophie's hands found the familiar keys. She started Mozart's sonata, the same one she'd prepared for the audition. At first, her playing was tentative, scared. But as she continued, something changed. She stopped thinking about Professor Brenner. She stopped thinking about failure. She just let the music flow through her. When she finished, Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. "That was beautiful," she finally said, "but I've heard you play better." "You know why?" "Because right now you're playing to prove something. Real music doesn't come from trying to prove people wrong. It comes from somewhere deeper." Over the following weeks, Mrs. Chen worked with Sophie differently than before. She didn't just teach her songs anymore. She taught her to feel the silence between notes, to understand that music wasn't just about the sounds you made, but about the spaces in between. She taught Sophie to trust her instincts, to let her emotions guide her fingers rather than just her memory. "You don't need eyes to see music," Mrs. Chen would say. "Music isn't something you see. It's something you live." Sophie practiced every day, not because she was trying to prove anything anymore, but because she couldn't imagine her life without it. While other kids her age were out playing or going to dances, Sophie was at that old piano. Her fingers developed calluses. Her back sometimes ached from sitting so long, but she didn't care. Years passed. Sophie turned 13, then 14, then 15. She grew taller, but stayed thin because her family still couldn't afford much. Her father kept working double shifts. Her little brother Leo got a job helping at the bakery after school. Everyone contributed what they could, and Sophie won competitions. Small ones at first in nearby towns, then bigger ones in the regional capital. Each victory came with a tiny cash prize, which she always gave straight to her parents. Each trophy sat on their mantel, proof that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't chasing an impossible dream after all. But there was always a ceiling. Competition judges would praise her talent, then quietly suggest she pursue teaching instead of performing. Conservatories would reject her applications without even hearing her play. Once, a concert hall manager told her mother, "We'd love to book her, but audiences want to see a performance, not just hear one." It was as if Professor Brenner's words had spread like poison through the entire music world. Every door Sophie approached seemed to close before she even knocked. The worst part was watching her family struggle. Her father's hair turned gray from stress. Her mother's hands became rough from taking in sewing work. Leo gave up on his dream of going to university so he could work full-time and help support them. One evening, when Sophie was 17, she overheard her parents talking in the kitchen. She'd gotten up to get water and heard their voices through the door. "We can't keep doing this," her father said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We're barely surviving. Leo's given up everything. And for what? She's incredibly talented, but if the world won't let her perform, maybe we need to accept reality." "Don't say that," her mother whispered. "Sophie's special. You know she is. Being special doesn't pay bills." Maybe that professor was right. Maybe she should consider teaching or something more practical. Sophie stood frozen in the hallway, her heart breaking. They'd sacrificed so much for her, and she'd given them nothing back except more struggle and disappointment. The next morning, she told Mrs. Chen she was thinking about giving up. Her teacher was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Come with me." Mrs. Chen led Sophie to a cabinet in the corner of her living room. Sophie heard her open it and shuffle through some papers. Then Mrs. Chen pressed something into Sophie's hands. It felt like a photograph. "I can't see this," Sophie said. "I know, but I'm going to tell you what it shows." That's me 40 years ago on stage at Carnegie Hall in New York City. I was 23 years old and I'd just performed for 3,000 people. It was the greatest night of my life. Sophie ran her fingers over the photograph, imagining what it must have looked like. 2 months later, Mrs. Chen continued, her voice growing softer. "My hands started hurting. The doctors said it was arthritis. They said I'd never play professionally again. They were right." "I didn't know," Sophie whispered. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. The music world took everything from me, my career, my dreams, my future, and it tried to make me bitter. But you know what I learned? They can take away the stages and the audiences and the applause, but they can never take away what music means to me. They can never take away what happens inside me when I hear a beautiful piece played with real feeling. She took Sophie's hands in her own weathered ones. You have something rare, child, something I haven't seen in decades of teaching. But more importantly, you have something that can't be taught. You have fire, and right now, you're about to let small-minded people extinguish it. Sophie felt tears running down her cheeks. What if I keep trying and keep failing? She asked. Then you fail, Mrs. Chen said simply. But at least you'll fail doing what you love. That's better than succeeding at something that means nothing to you. That evening, Mrs. Chen showed Sophie a letter she'd just received. Her hands were shaking as she read it aloud. It's from an old friend of mine, she explained. He runs a music competition in Vienna. Not at the conservatory, but independent. International. He owes me a favor from years ago, and he's agreed to give you an entry slot. Sophie's heart started pounding. Vienna? But that's where that arrogant fool humiliated you. I know, and that's exactly why you need to go back. Not for him. For yourself. To prove that his opinion never mattered in the first place. Sophie thought about her family, about the sacrifices they'd made, about Leo working at the bakery instead of going to school, about her father's gray hair and her mother's worn hands. I can't ask them for more money, she said. They've given too much already. You're not asking. I'm paying, Mrs. Chen said firmly. Consider it my investment in the future. When you're famous and playing in concert halls around the world, you can pay me back. What if I lose? Mrs. Chen smiled. Then you lose. But Sophie, you need to understand something. You've already lost as long as you let fear stop you from trying. The only real failure is letting that professor's words define your life. That night, Sophie made her decision. She would go back to Vienna, not to prove anything to Professor Brenner, but to prove something to herself, that she was more than her disability, that she was more than anyone's doubts or dismissals. She had no idea if she could win. She had no idea if anyone would even listen to her play. But Mrs. Chen was right about one thing. She had to try. The Vienna International Piano Competition was nothing like Sophie had imagined. When she and her mother arrived at the venue, the noise alone was overwhelming. Hundreds of people crowded the halls. Contestants warming up in practice rooms, families speaking dozens of different languages, reporters with cameras clicking away at everything. Sophie gripped her mother's arm tighter than usual. 5 years had passed since Professor Brenner had dismissed her from his conservatory. She was 17 now. No longer that frightened 12-year-old girl, but being back in Vienna brought all those memories flooding back. We can still leave, her mother whispered, sensing her daughter's fear. Nobody would blame you. Sophie shook her head. Mrs. Chen had used her life savings to get them here. Her father had taken time off work he couldn't afford to lose. Leo had given her his lucky charm, a small smooth stone he'd carried in his pocket since childhood. She wasn't turning back now. The competition rules were unusual. For the preliminary rounds, all performers would play behind a screen. The judges wouldn't see who was playing, only hear them. They'd be identified by number, not by name. It was meant to eliminate bias, to judge purely on talent rather than reputation or appearance. Sophie was contestant number 47. When she registered, she gave only her initials on the form, just SA, to avoid any prejudgment. The organizers raised eyebrows when they saw her white cane, but they said nothing. The rules were clear. Anyone could compete. The first round was held in a medium-sized auditorium. Sophie waited backstage with the other contestants, listening to them practice and talk nervously among themselves. She heard a girl near her speaking rapid French to what sounded like her teacher. Another contestant, a boy with a deep voice, was doing breathing exercises to calm his nerves. Nobody spoke to Sophie. She wondered if they even noticed her sitting there in the corner. That was fine. She wasn't here to make friends. Contestant 47, a voice called out. Her mother squeezed her hand one last time. Play like you're back home in Mrs. Chen's living room. Just you and the music. Sophie made her way to the stage, counting her steps carefully. Someone guided her behind the screen and to the piano. She sat down, adjusted herself on the bench, and took a deep breath. The piece she'd chosen for the first round was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It wasn't the most technically difficult piece she could play, but it required something else. It required feeling. It required the player to pour their soul into every note. She placed her fingers on the keys and began. The first few notes floated into the air like whispers. Soft, gentle, almost fragile. Then the melody began to build, each phrase flowing into the next like water. Sophie forgot about the screen, forgot about the judges, forgot about everything except the music. She played the way Mrs. Chen had taught her, not just hitting notes, but living inside them. Every pause meant something. Every crescendo told a story. When she reached the piece's emotional peak, she felt tears on her own cheeks, though she wasn't sure when she'd started crying. The final notes faded into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she heard it. Applause, not just polite clapping, but real applause. Even from behind the screen, she could feel that something had connected. She made it through to the second round. Then the third. Each time she played a different piece, each one more challenging than the last. Beethoven, Rachmaninoff, Liszt. The competition narrowed from over 200 contestants to 50, then to 20, then to 10, and Sophie was still there. The other contestants started noticing her now. She heard them whispering when she passed by. "That's 47, someone said. "Did you hear her Rachmaninoff?" It was unbelievable. Another voice replied, "I heard she's blind." Can you imagine? By the semifinals, only 5 contestants remained. The performances would still be behind screens, but the audience was much larger now. The local newspapers had started covering the competition. Music critics from across Europe had flown in to watch. Sophie's mother read her the early reviews. Most praised the high level of talent. One critic wrote that contestant 47 had an unusual depth of emotional expression that transcends technical perfection. Another called her interpretation of Beethoven haunting and unforgettable, but Sophie tried not to think about any of that. Reviews didn't matter. Critics didn't matter. All that mattered was the music. The semifinals were brutal. Each contestant had to perform 2 pieces, one classical and one romantic. Sophie chose Bach's Goldberg Variations and Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Both were pieces she'd played 1,000 times. Pieces she knew so well they felt like extensions of her own thoughts. When her turn came, she walked behind that screen for what she hoped wouldn't be the last time. She sat at the piano and let her hands find their place. The Bach came first. It was mathematical, precise, like a beautiful equation. Each variation built on the last, creating patterns that were both complex and perfectly logical. She played it with clarity and control, her fingers moving across the keys with absolute certainty. Then came the Chopin. This was different. This was fire and passion and heartbreak all mixed together. She threw everything into it. Every frustration from the past 5 years, every moment of doubt, every time someone had told her she couldn't do this. The music poured out of her like a confession. When she finished, the applause was immediate and thunderous. She could hear people standing up. Someone in the audience shouted, "Brava!" in Italian. 2 days later, the results were announced. 3 finalists, numbers 23, 31, and 47. Sophie had made it to the finals. But there was a change. The finals would be different from the preliminary rounds. There would be no screen. The contestants would perform in front of the full audience, in front of the judges, with nothing hidden. Their identities would be revealed. Sophie's stomach dropped when she heard this. She'd made it this far because nobody knew who she was. They judged her purely on her playing. But now they'd see her. They'd see the white cane, the way her eyes didn't focus on anything, the fact that she was blind. Would it change how they heard her music? The night before the finals, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay in her hotel room, listening to the city sounds outside, cars honking, people laughing as they walked by. Somewhere in the distance, a street musician playing violin. Her mother was asleep in the other bed, exhausted from the stress of the past week. Sophie wished she could talk to Mrs. Chen, but they couldn't afford international phone calls. Instead, she got up and felt her way to the small table where she'd left Leo's lucky stone. She held it in her hand, feeling its smooth surface, and thought about her little brother working at the bakery. About her father at the factory. About Mrs. Chen in her small living room with the out-of-tune piano. They all believed in her. Even when she didn't believe in herself, they did. The finals were held in Vienna's grandest concert hall. Sophie had never performed in a space this large. She could feel the size of it just from the echo of people's voices. 2,000 seats, her mother told her. Every single one of them filled. The 2 other finalists performed first. Number 23 was a young man from Japan who played with incredible technical precision. Number 31 was a woman from Russia, whose performance was powerful and dramatic. Both were extraordinary. Both received standing ovations. Then it was Sophie's turn. As she walked onto the stage with her white cane, she heard the audience gasp. The whispers spread through the hall like wildfire. "She's blind. That's number 47? How is that possible?" Sophie made her way to the piano, counting her steps just like she'd practiced. 28 steps from the wing to the bench. She sat down and adjusted her position. Then she heard a voice from the judges section, a voice she'd never forgotten even after 5 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Professor Brenner's voice rang out across the hall. He was one of the judges. Of course he was. "Before we begin, I must address a concern regarding the suitability of this contestant given her obvious limitations." The hall went silent. Sophie felt her heart stop. "However," he continued, and Sophie could hear something strange in his voice now, something that sounded almost like pain. "The rules of this competition are clear. We judge on merit alone. Contestant 47 has earned her place here fairly. She will perform." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to kindness. But it was permission. And sometimes that's all you need. Sophie placed her fingers on the keys. For her final piece, she'd chosen Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, the piece written by a composer who'd also lost one of his senses, who'd created beauty despite every obstacle the world threw at him. It was the perfect choice. Because this wasn't just about playing well anymore. This was about proving that limitations only exist in the minds of people who are too afraid to look beyond them. She began to play, and the entire world disappeared. The first notes of Beethoven's Appassionata fell into the silence like drops of water into a still pond, soft, deliberate, careful. Sophie's fingers moved across the keys with the certainty of someone who'd memorized not just the notes, but the feeling behind every single one. She'd played this piece hundreds of times in Mrs. Chen's living room. She'd played it in her mind during sleepless nights. She'd played it with her fingers tapping against her bed frame when she couldn't get to a real piano. This wasn't just a sonata to her. It was a conversation with Beethoven himself, a composer who'd understood what it meant to lose something precious and keep creating anyway. The opening movement started gently, almost questioning. But Sophie knew what was coming. She could feel it building inside her like a storm gathering strength. Her body began to sway slightly with the music, something she never thought about but always did when she played. It was as if the music moved through her rather than from her. In the audience, people leaned forward in their seats. This wasn't like the other performances they'd heard tonight. Those had been technically perfect, impressive, the kind of playing that made you appreciate the skill involved. But this was different. This was something that reached inside your chest and grabbed hold of your heart. Sophie's mother sat in the audience with tears already streaming down her face. She'd heard her daughter play countless times, but never like this, never with this much power, this much raw emotion. It was as if Sophie was pouring every ounce of pain and determination from the past 5 years into the piano. The music grew louder, more intense. Sophie's fingers flew across the keys and passages that were brutally difficult. Most pianists had to concentrate hard just to hit the right notes in these sections. But Sophie made it look effortless, as if her hands knew exactly where to go without her even thinking about it, because they did. When you can't see the keys, you learn to trust your muscle memory completely. You learn to feel the distance between notes, to sense where your hands need to be. Sophie had been doing this since she was 4 years old. The piano wasn't something separate from her. It was an extension of who she was. In the judges section, Professor Brenner sat frozen. His hands were gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He recognized this girl now. Of course he did. She'd grown, changed, but he remembered those eyes that didn't focus, that determined set of her jaw. This was the 12-year-old child he'd dismissed 5 years ago. And she was magnificent. The other judges were scribbling notes frantically, but Brenner couldn't move. He could only listen as this young woman proved every single thing he'd said to her was wrong. He told her blind people couldn't feel music the way real pianists did, but what he was hearing now had more feeling, more soul, more genuine emotion than most performances he'd heard in his entire career. The second movement began, slower and more melancholy. Here Sophie showed a different side of her talent. The notes became whispers, confessions, secrets shared in the dark. Every phrase breathed. Every pause meant something. She wasn't just playing Beethoven's notes. She was living inside his emotions, understanding the loneliness and struggle that had created this music. A music critic in the audience forgot to take notes. He just sat there listening, experiencing something he'd later describe in his review as a performance that reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. The third movement exploded like lightning. This was the famous finale, the part where Beethoven unleashed everything he'd been holding back. It required incredible technical skill, but more than that, it required courage. You had to be willing to take risks, to push yourself to the edge of what you could control. Sophie took those risks. Her hands moved so fast they were almost a blur. The music thundered through the concert hall, filling every corner of the massive space. She leaned into the dramatic passages, her whole body engaged with the performance. At one point, she was playing so forcefully that one of the piano strings audibly vibrated with the power of it. But it never felt violent or aggressive. Even in the loudest moments, there was purpose. There was meaning. Every crashing chord was building towards something, telling a story that everyone in the audience could feel even if they couldn't put it into words. Then came the quiet section in the middle of the storm. Suddenly, after all that power and fury, the music became gentle again. It was like standing in the eye of a hurricane, that moment of unexpected peace. Sophie played these measures with such tenderness that several people in the audience found themselves holding their breath, afraid to break the spell. And then the storm returned, bigger and more powerful than before. The final pages of the Appassionata are among the most demanding in all of piano literature. The left hand and right hand have to do completely different things simultaneously, moving at incredible speed while maintaining perfect clarity. Most pianists struggled with this section even after years of practice. Sophie played it as if she'd been born to do exactly this. Her fingers found every note with absolute precision. The rhythm never wavered. The melody sang out above the accompaniment like a voice crying out in triumph. This was no longer just about proving she could play. This was about showing the world what music could be when someone gave themselves to it completely. In those final minutes, something magical happened in that concert hall. It wasn't just about a blind girl playing piano anymore. It wasn't about disability or overcoming obstacles or any of those things people would write about later. In that moment, there was just the music, pure, perfect, undeniable. The final chords crashed down like waves against rocks, powerful and inevitable. Sophie's hand struck the keys one last time, and the sound rang out through the hall, echoing off the walls before slowly fading into silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed. It was as if the entire audience was frozen, unable to process what they'd just experienced. Then someone in the back row stood up. Then another person. Then another. Within seconds, the entire concert hall was on its feet. The applause was deafening. People weren't just clapping. They were shouting, crying. Some of the other musicians in the audience, people who'd spent their entire lives studying piano, were applauding with tears streaming down their faces. Sophie sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, barely able to believe it was over. She could hear the applause, feel the vibrations of 2,000 people on their feet, but it felt distant, almost unreal. She'd gone so deep into the music that coming back to the regular world felt strange. Her mother was sobbing in her seat, her hands over her mouth. The woman sitting next to her, a complete stranger, was hugging her and crying too. Across the hall, Mrs. Chen's friend, the organizer who'd given Sophie her chance, was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. The applause went on and on. 5 minutes, then 10. People started shouting, "Brava!" Someone threw flowers onto the stage. The other 2 finalists, who were waiting backstage, looked at each other with the same thought. They'd played beautifully, but they hadn't played like that. Nobody had. Finally, Sophie stood up and gave a small bow in the direction of where she thought the audience was. The applause somehow got even louder. She turned to leave the stage, but the audience wouldn't let her go. They kept clapping, kept cheering, until she had to come back and bow again. In the judges section, the other panelists were already conferring excitedly, but Professor Brenner just sat there. His face was buried in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. One of the other judges leaned over and asked if he was all right. Brenner looked up and his face was wet with tears. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was so terribly wrong." Backstage, Sophie's mother found her and wrapped her in the tightest hug of her life. Neither of them could speak. They just held each other and cried while the applause continued to thunder through the walls. Sophie had done it. She'd played the performance of her lifetime. But more than that, she'd proved something that went beyond music. She'd proved that the only real disability is the inability to see past our own narrow definitions of what's possible. Now all that was left was to wait for the judge's decision. The judge's deliberation room was supposed to be soundproof, but the 5 panelists inside didn't need much time to talk. They sat around a long wooden table, each with their scorecards in front of them. Usually these discussions took hours. There would be debates, disagreements, careful consideration of every technical detail. Not this time. The head judge looked around the table. "I think we all know," he said simply. One by one, the judges nodded. They filled out their cards in silence. When they compared them, the result was unanimous. All 5 had written the same number, 47. Professor Brenner signed his card with a shaking hand. He'd been a judge at dozens of competitions over the years. He'd never felt like this before, never felt the weight of his own mistakes pressing down on him so heavily. Outside, Sophie waited in a small room backstage with her mother and the other 2 finalists. Nobody was talking much. The young man from Japan sat in the corner with his eyes closed, probably replaying his performance in his mind. The woman from Russia was pacing nervously. Sophie just sat still, her hands folded in her lap. She felt strangely calm. Whatever happened next, she'd done what she came here to do. She'd played her heart out. She'd proven to herself that Professor Brenner's words 5 years ago didn't define her. That was enough. It had to be enough. "They're calling us back," someone said from the doorway. The 3 finalists made their way back onto the stage. The audience had returned to their seats, but the energy in the hall was electric. Everyone knew they'd witnessed something special tonight. The question was whether the judges had seen it too. The head judge stepped up to the microphone. He gave a long speech about the high caliber of talent, about how difficult the decision had been, about the future of classical music. Sophie barely heard any of it. Her heart was pounding so loudly in her ears that it drowned out almost everything else. "The 3rd-place winner," the judge finally announced, "is contestant number 23. The young man from Japan walked forward to accept his medal. The applause was warm and genuine. He'd played beautifully. In any other year, he might have won. 2nd place goes to contestant number 31. The Russian woman accepted her medal with grace, though Sophie could hear the disappointment in her footsteps as she walked across the stage. There was a long pause. Sophie felt like the entire world had stopped spinning. And the winner of this year's Vienna International Piano Competition, by unanimous decision of the judges, is contestant number 47, Sophie Adler. The words took a moment to register, then the concert hall erupted. The applause was even louder than it had been after her performance. People were on their feet again, cheering, whistling. Sophie's mother screamed with joy from her seat in the audience. Sophie walked forward, her white cane tapping against the stage floor. Someone placed a medal around her neck and a bouquet of flowers in her arms. She stood there, overwhelmed, barely able to process what was happening. She'd won. She'd actually won. But the real surprise came 3 days later. The competition had been recorded, as all major competitions were. Usually these recordings got filed away in archives that nobody watched. But someone had posted Sophie's performance online, and it had started spreading like wildfire across the internet. Within a week, the video had been viewed 10 million times, then 20 million, then 50 million. People from all over the world were watching this blind 17-year-old girl play Beethoven in a way that made them cry, made them feel, made them remember why music mattered.